I took the babysitting job because, honestly, I was desperate. Rent was due, my car needed repairs, and this gig was offering double the usual rate for one night of work. It came through an agency I'd worked with before, so I figured it was legit, even though the description was vague. Overnight care for a child in a remote location. When I arrived at the mansion, though, I immediately felt like I'd made a mistake. The place was massive, like something out of an old Gothic novel. The driveway alone was a mile long, cutting through dense woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight. When I finally pulled up, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just this oppressive silence. The house itself was grand, but unsettling. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and most of the windows were dark. Inside, the furniture was draped in sheets, and the hallways were dimly lit, with shadows pooling in every corner. The parents greeted me briefly, a tall, stern-looking man and a woman who seemed nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Their daughter, Clara, was waiting quietly by the staircase. She was about 6, with long dark hair and big eyes that felt ancient. That's the only way I can describe it. She barely spoke, just nodded when her mother introduced me, and then went back to clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked as old as the house. Before they left, the mother handed me a folded piece of paper. "These are the rules," she said, her voice low and serious. "Please follow them exactly. Clara's safety and yours depends on it." Then they were gone, leaving me alone in this cavernous house with Clara, the list of rules, and a growing sense of unease. The rules were strange. I unfolded the paper and read through them, half thinking it was some kind of joke. Lock Clara's door at exactly 9 p.m. and don't unlock it until 6 a.m. Don't respond if she talks in her sleep. Avoid looking at the mirror in the upstairs hallway after 10 p.m. If you hear footsteps in the hallway at night, stay in the room until they stop. I laughed nervously to myself, but there was no humor in it. The mother's tone replayed in my head. Clara's safety and yours depends on it. The first few hours were uneventful. Clara was quiet, spending most of her time drawing while I tried to pass the time scrolling through my phone. Her drawings, though, were unsettling. They were of the mansion, but with shadowy figures surrounding it, their eyes glowing in the dark. I asked her about them, trying to sound casual. She just smiled faintly and said, "They like being near the house." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. Kids have overactive imaginations, right? As the sun set, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The air grew colder, and the silence outside became suffocating. Even the faint creaks and groans of the old mansion felt sharper, more deliberate. At 9 p.m. sharp, I walked Clara to her room and locked the door behind her as instructed. She didn't protest or even seem surprised, just climbed into bed, clutching her rabbit. "Good night," she whispered softly. I hesitated before responding, unsure if even that was breaking the rules. I stayed near her door for a while, listening to the faint rustling of her moving under the blankets. Then, as the clock ticked closer to 10 p.m., I made my way back down the hallway toward the small sitting room. That's when I caught sight of the mirror. It was antique, with an ornate golden frame placed right at the hallway's bend. I remembered the rule and quickened my pace, keeping my gaze averted. But then I froze. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement. Not in the hallway, but in the mirror itself. Curiosity got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't, but I turned to face the mirror. My reflection stared back, but something was off. At first, I couldn't pinpoint it, but then I noticed the smile. I wasn't smiling. My face was neutral, frozen in confusion. But my reflection's lips curled into this wide, unnatural grin. The longer I stared, the more distorted it became, stretching too far, the teeth impossibly white and sharp. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. I forced myself to look away and hurried back to the sitting room, heart pounding. I could still feel the mirror's presence, like it was watching me, even though I wasn't in front of it anymore. Sitting on the couch, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But then I heard it, a faint whispering, almost like wind, but it was coming from upstairs. Clara's room. I rushed upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The whispering grew louder as I approached Clara's door. It wasn't her voice. It was deeper, almost guttural, and it sent chills through my body. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I stopped myself just in time. "Don't open the door," I reminded myself, gripping the list of rules in my pocket. I pressed my ear to the door instead, and I could hear Clara murmuring in her sleep. "They're at the door," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange calmness. I stepped back, my hands shaking. That's when I noticed the shadow under the door. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't Clara's. It was too tall, too broad, and it shifted like someone was pacing back and forth. Then the scratching started. Soft at first, like nails lightly dragging along wood, but it quickly became frantic. The door rattled as if someone or something was trying to force it open. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest, and retreated to the sitting room, praying the rules would hold. The rattling eventually stopped, but the house didn't feel any safer. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the parents or even the police. What would I say? That their house was haunted? That I was hearing things? My thoughts were interrupted by a faint creak from the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. But these weren't the light taps of a child or the soft shuffle of an adult. They were heavy, resonant, and too slow to be human. I stared at the staircase, my breath caught in my throat. A shadow shifted at the top of the stairs, just out of the light. It didn't move like a person. It was jerky, unnatural, as if it were trying to mimic human movement, but failing. My grip on the phone tightened. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me not to move. The steps continued, coming down the stairs one at a time, until the shadow stretched across the bottom step. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing. The shadow lingered at the bottom of the staircase, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Whatever it was, it didn't make a sound anymore. The silence was worse than the footsteps. My eyes darted to the hallway mirror, but I forced myself to look away, remembering the rule. I felt trapped, stuck between the rules, the shadow, and the oppressive weight of the house. I gripped the list of rules in my pocket like it was a lifeline. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. Finally, the shadow seemed to retreat, sliding out of sight as if it had never been there. I didn't dare move from the couch. The wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the windows, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers again, blending with the wind. Clara's words echoed in my mind. They liked being near the house. The rest of the night blurred into a haze of paranoia and dread. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until sunrise. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to think I might make it through, the knocking began. It was coming from Clara's door. It wasn't frantic, but slow and deliberate. Each knock spaced apart like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know it wasn't in any hurry. I crept up the stairs, my legs trembling with every step. The knocking continued, and as I got closer, I realized there was a voice, low and distorted, calling my name. "Let me in," it said, mimicking the voice of Clara's mother. I gripped the doorknob tightly, the rules screaming in my head. "Do not open the door." The voice grew louder, more insistent, but I stayed frozen in place. Finally, the knocking stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, trying to control my breathing. My hand was still clutching the doorknob, and I could feel how cold it had gotten. The air around me felt heavy, almost like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but fear rooted me in place. Then I heard Clara's voice from the other side of the door. "They're still here," she said softly. Her tone was calm, like she wasn't scared at all, like this was something she was used to. My stomach twisted. The rules said not to respond, but I was terrified she might actually be in danger. I forced myself to step away from the door, retreating back to the sitting room. I kept telling myself over and over, follow the rules, even though I was starting to doubt whether they'd actually protect us. Back in the sitting room, I sat with my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the door to the hallway. Every creak of the house, every groan of the wind outside made me flinch. My phone was useless, no signal this far out, and even if I could call someone, what would I say? That something was playing tricks on me, something that felt older and angrier than anything I could understand. I tried to distract myself by looking through the books stacked on a nearby shelf, but one of them caught my eye. It wasn't dusty like the others and looked out of place. When I opened it, I realized it wasn't a book at all. It was a diary. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, and as I skimmed through, I felt my stomach sink. It described things that matched what I was experiencing. Shadows that moved on their own, voices mimicking people you knew, and rules meant to keep them at bay. One entry stuck with me. They don't like when you break the rules. They make you pay. As I flipped through the diary, the entries became more frantic, the handwriting messier. One described a babysitter who didn't follow the rules. She opened the door when she wasn't supposed to. The next page was ripped out, but the words on the opposite side bled through. They took her. I could hear her screaming, but no one ever found her. I slammed the diary shut, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever wrote it was warning me, begging anyone who found it to take the rules seriously. The wind outside picked up again, and for a second, I thought I heard something scrape against the window. I glanced toward it, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the glass. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the window, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it smiled. But I blinked, and it was just me again, pale and wide-eyed. I turned away quickly, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone settling over me like a heavy weight. The house felt alive, like it was breathing with me, watching me. Every time I moved, the floorboards groaned under my weight, but sometimes they creaked when I was perfectly still. I kept telling myself it was just the house settling, but deep down I knew better. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were heavier, faster, and they didn't stop at the staircase. They were coming down the hallway toward the sitting room. I grabbed the list of rules from my pocket, holding it like a talisman, as if the paper itself could protect me. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I stared at the handle, half expecting it to turn. Instead, there was a low growl, guttural and inhuman, vibrating through the walls. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give out. Then just as suddenly as it started, the sound vanished. The silence that followed was so oppressive it felt like the house was daring me to make a mistake. The sun couldn't rise fast enough. I kept checking my phone, but the hours dragged by like they were mocking me. At one point, I heard Clara murmuring again from her room. Her voice was muffled through the door, but it sounded like she was having a conversation. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to make out the words. "They're angry," she whispered, her tone eerily calm. "They don't like waiting." I stumbled back from the door, nearly tripping over my own feet. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I opened that door, whatever was outside would be waiting for me instead of her. I stayed in the sitting room for the rest of the night, clutching the diary and the list of rules like they were the only things keeping me tethered to reality. Every creak and whisper in the house felt like a warning, a reminder that I wasn't supposed to be here. Finally, the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, and the oppressive weight in the house lifted slightly. The wind outside died down, and the whispers faded. At exactly 6 a.m., I unlocked Clara's door with trembling hands. She was sitting on her bed, looking out the window, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her lap. "They're gone now," she said softly, without even turning to look at me. Her calmness was unnerving, as if she'd been through this routine countless times before. When the parents returned later that morning, I was ready to unload on them, demand answers, anything. But when they walked in, the mother just smiled faintly and said, "Thank you for following the rules." That was it. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the horror I'd endured. I wanted to scream at her, but the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't indifference. It was fear, the kind you see in someone who knows better than to push their luck. As I packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The shadows in the house seemed deeper, and every corner felt like it held a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. As I walked to my car, I glanced up at Clara's window. She was standing there, her small figure framed by the curtains. But she wasn't alone. A dark silhouette loomed behind her, tall and unnatural, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I blinked, and they were gone, replaced by empty curtains swaying slightly in the breeze. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the night in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I'd broken a rule. Then, a week later, I got an anonymous message on my phone. No number, no contact info, just one line of text. They liked you. Come back soon. I blocked the number immediately, but the feeling of dread hasn't left me. Sometimes, at night, I hear footsteps in my hallway. And once, just once, I caught my reflection smiling at me when I wasn't.